Good evening, everyone. This is International Master Oladapo once again, and I'm actually here today to make a very short video about some of the very basic things we need to learn when it comes to chess, like the basics, the fundamentals. What are the things you're supposed to do when you start a game? What are the thought process? What are the things going on in your mind? Where do you put your pieces and all that stuff? This is actually it's a very simple process which is actually geared towards beginners, stroke intermediate players. And so pretty much we're going to break down the phases of the game, what you're supposed to do during the phases of the game, and then when you're done past that phase, what happens afterwards. So let's get right into it. As we know, we have four main squares in the center of the board, which we call the center. The four main squares are the e4, d4, e4, d4, we have e5 and d5 squares. So now, anytime you make a move in a chess game, you have to make sure you control one of these four squares. Is very important. Okay? So, one of the things we also need to learn is one of the things we already know based on the game is we have the three phases of the game, which is the opening phase, we have the middle game, and then we have the end game. So what is the opening phase? There are three aspects of the opening phase, and I'm going to break them down like this. The first aspect has to do with controlling the central squares of your pawns, which could be the e4, d4, e5, or d5 squares. You want to control the central squares of your pawn, for example, move your pawn to e4. Your pawn controls the square e4 and also controls the square d5. Now, why does the pawn control the square d5? Anytime you can make a capture on that square, you control that square. Anytime you can make a capture on any squares, you control that square. So the pawn on e4 controls not just the e4 but the d5 square. Okay? So remember, we're talking about the three phases of the opening. So the first phase is to control the center squares of your pawn. One. You want to control the center squares with your minor pieces, the knights and bishops. What are your minor pieces? Your minor pieces are pretty much your knights and your bishops. Now, for example, the knight on f3 is controlling the e5 square and the d4 square. The bishop on c4 is controlling the d5 square. Remember, every time you make a move in a chess game, you want to make sure you control at least one or two, or if possible, all the central squares, because that's actually where the battle starts from. So in this situation, we have the knight on f3 controlling the d4, e5, as we said, and bishop controlling the c4, the d5 square. Now, the last phase of the opening is to keep your king safe, castles. I'm going to say this again. Remember, I said in chess we have three phases. We have the opening, we have the middle game, and then we have the end game. In the opening phase, there are three things you always want to do. Control the center of your pawns. Pawn on e4 controls d5. Control the center square of your minor pieces, which is your knights and bishops. Knight controls e5 on d4. And bishop controls the c4, the d5 square. Bishop on c4 controls the d5 square. And the last phase of the middle game is to keep your king safe, which is what we call castling. Right. Now we're done with the opening phase. Now the next phase of the game is the middle game. Now, the same situation we have in the opening. We have part of it, but with a whole lot more things to do. So what am I talking about? In the next part, which is the middle game, you still want to control your center squares with your pawn. How do you do that? Moving your pawn to d4. The pawn on d4 doesn't control just the d4 square, but also controls the e5 square. You remember why? Yes, because you can make a capture on that square. Anytime you can make a capture on the square, you control that square. Now, by moving your pawn to d4, now your bishop is free to get out into the position. And now you have several squares for the bishop. We have the d2, we have the e3, we have the f4, and then we have the g5. But for the knight, we have just one good move for the knights, which is knight c3. Now, why is this the only good move for the knight in this position? Remember what we said earlier, when you develop your pieces, you always want to control the central squares. Now, there are three main knight moves in this position. We have knight to a3, we have knight to d2, and then we have knight to c3. So we have these three knight moves. Now, if you look at three of these moves, only two of them have something to do with the central squares. The knight a3 certainly not. Now, the knight on d2 controls the e4 square. Why? Because it actually can make a capture on that square. But the knight on c3 controls not just the e4 square, but the d5 square. So this is another thing that teaches you, whenever you have a position, you always want to look for situations where a piece you move can do more things than just one. If you have a chance of attacking and defending, that's a good idea instead of just defending the threat. So coming back to this, the middle game, we have about 5 main things we want to do over and over and over and over again. Like I said, this video is pretty much geared towards the beginners, intermediate, just like make you get into the game without any kind of errors. So we have 2 minor pieces on the queen side, so we want to develop our knight first for the reason I gave earlier. Why? Because the knight has just one good move. Meanwhile, the bishop has several: e3, f4, and g5. So after the knight moves to c3, now the 5 stages: control the center squares of your pawn, we've done that. The second stage, develop your minor pieces. There's a knight on c3, we're going to move the bishop to f4. Now the third part of the middle game is to connect your rooks. What do we mean by connecting the rooks? When you move the queen off the last rank, which is also what we call the back rank, you want to move the queen either to e2. What's the queen doing on e2? Defending the bishop on c4. The rooks are connected. Or we want to move the queen to d2. What's the queen doing on d2? Defending the bishop on f4. And then the rooks are still connected. So now remember this, in the middle game, there are 5 stages. The first stage of the middle game is to control the central squares of your pawn. The second stage is to control the central squares with your minor pieces, right? The third stage of the middle game is to connect your rooks, move your queen off the last rank or the back rank so that your rooks are connected. The fourth stage is to centralize your rooks. Rook comes to e1, and then rook comes to d1. Centralize pretty much means you're moving your rooks so that they can control the 2 main central files, which are the E file and the D file. So that's the fourth thing you always want to do. Remember this. You want to do this as long as your opponent gives us the chance to make all these moves. Now, the last thing we always want to do in the middle game is to change the structure of the pawns. That's the last thing you always want to do, to change the structure of the pawns. What do I mean by that? For example, we have a pawn on d4 and there's another pawn on e4. If I have to change the structure of this pawn, I can move the pawn to e5, right? Now, notice what just happened. When I move my pawn to e5, I've vacated the e4 square for the knight. So the knight has possibilities of having more squares to control in the opponent's position. Or better still, if I move the pawn to d5, guess what? I've vacated the d4 square, which also gives the knight another square to jump to, whereby it can have more control over the position of the opponent. These things are very simple and straightforward. Another way to change the structure of the pawn is move the pawn to a4. What's the point of a4? If you could look at this pawn move, like every move counts in chess. It doesn't matter what the move looks like. There is always a reason behind the move. The pawn on a4 controls the b5 square and also gains some space. So think about this. The b5 square belongs to the black pieces, but it's being controlled by the pawn on a4, bishop on c4, and knight on c3. So anytime you change the structure of the pawn, you pretty much allow yourself to have more mobility, so your pieces can move freer. And then for every movement of the pawn, your opponent's positions gets choked up. Now, those are the 5 main stages of the middle game. Now the end game. Now there's one thing that really lets us know what is happening when we get to the end game. And what is that? The number of pieces on the board. So when we talk about the end game, we're talking about very few pieces left on the board. And there is one thing that is very, very important that we always must remember. Once you get to the end game, your king becomes a very strong piece. You know, there was a book I read so many years ago. It pretty much talks about the king, and there's this quote that says, an active king, it has a central supremacy, an active king. So if your king is going to get active, your king has to find its way into the center of the board when there are fewer pieces on the board. Because winning a game or losing a game or even drawing a game is a lot based or hinged on the position of your king, even in equal setting. That means when you have the equal number of pieces, you have the same number of pieces, your opponent also has the same number of pieces. So the most important thing we want to learn, we want to know, we want to always find out is when you get to the end game, the king's position is very important. So you want to bring your king into the center of the board as quick as possible. That's one. Now the second thing you always want to pay attention to in the end game is you don't want to rush your moves. Never rush in the end game. Never rush in the end game. Because if you rush in the end game, pretty much you might just lose the game right away. Because if you make any mistake in the opening, you have a chance of getting the mistake right when you get to the middle game. And if you make a mistake in the middle game, you have a chance. There's always a chance of you correcting the mistake or getting it right, maybe in the end game. But any mistakes made in the end game can be fixed also. You want to really try as much as possible not to make any mistake that really compromise your position. And remember this: when we get to the end game, it's about your king's position and also being very, very patient, extra patient compared to any part of the ball, part of the game. So to recap, we talked about the three phases of the game, which we mentioned, and we all know the three phases being the opening, the middle game, and the end game. And we said in the opening phase, we want to control the central squares using our pawns, 1, using our minor pieces, 2, and then keep the king safe. The first three phases of the opening. The middle game, we want to still control the central squares using our pawns, 1, using our minor pieces, a knight and a bishop. And then after that, we want to connect our rooks by moving the queen off the last rank, either protecting the bishop on c4 or protecting the bishop on e4 by going to d2. Then after that, we want to centralize the rooks, bring the rook to the center of the board, where they have more influence. And then lastly, we want to change the structure of the pawn. For every pawn move you make, you create some space for you and take a lot of space away from your opponent. And then lastly, when we talk about the end game, it's pretty much about the positioning of your king. So when you find out there are fewer pieces on the board, there are substitutions you don't really have to castle. Just move your king to either e2 or e7, connect your rooks, get them in the game. And of course, the other part of the end game we want to really be aware of is about being very patient, never be in a hurry to just make a move in the end game. So I'm going to share some games periodically with us, concerning all the stages of the game. I mean, there are 1,001 games used as examples. What somebody did right, what someone did wrong. And I'm going to say this: it doesn't matter what your rating is, doesn't matter what your title is. Once you go wrong, when it comes to all the basic and the principles and the fundamentals, you are going to get punished. Okay, that's it for today, and always remember to share the video if you learn one or two things from it. Like I said, this particular video is pretty much for beginners. Like, subscribe, and all that, so that you could look out for my other videos. Okay, and you all take care and enjoy the rest of the evening. Bye for now.